The moment Louisa Prescott raised the revolver toward the stranger on the road, her hand was steady, even though she knew with cold certainty that she had only one bullet left in the cylinder. The afternoon sun had hammered the Texas panhandle flat and merciless, baking the red dust into something that tasted like rust at the back of the throat. It was the summer of 1878, and the land between Amarillo and the small ranching settlement of Hales Crossing was the kind of emptiness that swallowed men whole and returned nothing but their boots. Louisa had driven her wagon along this road 100 times, had ridden it on horseback in the dark when her husband was still alive, and had needed the doctor brought out from town in the middle of the night. She knew every rock, every crease in the earth, every thorn bush that clutched at wagon wheels like desperate hands. She knew this road the way she knew the lines of her own palms. And she knew the man on the horse was not from anywhere around here. He came from the south, riding at an easy walk, his horse a dark bay with a white stripe down its nose. He was tall in the saddle, lean in the shoulders, wearing a dust-colored duster that had seen better years. A wide-brimmed hat sat low on his head, throwing shadow across his face, but she could see enough. She could see the gun on his hip, which told her nothing, because every man west of the Mississippi wore iron at his side in those days. She could see the bedroll tied behind his saddle, the saddlebags worn at the seams, the rifle in the scabbard. A man traveling light, traveling far, belonging nowhere in particular. Louisa had learned in the 14 months since she buried her husband Thomas that belonging nowhere was the most dangerous kind of man there was. She pulled the wagon to a stop in the middle of the road, set the brake handle, and took the revolver from beneath the seat where she kept it wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth. She checked the cylinder out of habit, though she already knew what she would find. 5 spent casings and 1 live round. She had used 4 bullets on the 3 men who had come to her property 3 days ago with papers they claimed were legal, demanding she sign her land over to a cattle company out of Denver. She had not used the 5th bullet, though she had thought about it in the long and terrible hours that followed. That was the bullet she had kept for herself, in case they came back and she could not stop them any other way. She had kept it instead, and she was glad of it now as she raised the gun toward the stranger. He saw it and stopped his horse without a word 30 feet from her wagon. He raised both hands slowly, away from his body, palms forward. He did not reach for the gun at his hip. He did not make any sudden movement. He simply sat there, hands raised, looking at her with a patience that surprised her. "I do not want your trouble," she said. Her voice came out strong, which was a small miracle, because inside she was shaking the way a fiddle string shakes after you've plucked it. "And I want to know which direction trouble is coming from before you answer me anything else." He held her gaze for a moment before he spoke. His voice was low and unhurried, like creek water moving over smooth stones. "Behind me," he said simply. "South, about 3 miles, maybe less. 4 riders, moving fast." She stared at him. "How do you know they are trouble?" "Because one of them has a rope on his saddle with a fresh noose already tied," he said, "and they are not driving cattle." Her stomach turned over. She lowered the revolver half an inch, not all the way, but enough to show she was listening. "Who are they after?" "Could not say for certain," the man answered. "Could be me. Could be you. Could be anyone on this road." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something she could not entirely read. "But the way they were eyeing your wagon tracks in the dust when I passed them makes me think they are not coming for me." A sound rose then at the edges of her awareness, carried by the dry wind from the south, the faint drum of hooves. Too many hooves for one rider, too fast for a social call. Louisa's fingers tightened on the revolver. Her mind moved with a terrible, cold clarity. 1 bullet, 4 riders. A farm 3 miles to the northeast, where her daughter Clara was home alone, 7 years old, probably sitting on the porch with the cat and a piece of bread, and absolutely no idea that any of this was happening. "Get down from that horse," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Ma'am, I do not think that is the wisest plan right now." "I did not ask for your opinion on my plans," she said. "I asked you to get down from that horse." I have one bullet, and I will not waste it on you if you cooperate, but I will not make you any promises if you do not." He swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion, both hands still visible, and stood beside his horse in the dust of the road, looking at her with those calm, dark eyes. "What is your name?" she asked. "Levi Weston," he said. "Louisa Prescott." She came down from the wagon with more speed than grace, keeping the gun in her hand. "Those men behind you, do they have a reason to be coming after me specifically, or is this general lawlessness?" "That depends," he said. "Are you the widow who owns the property at the bend of Cutter Creek, about 3 miles north of here?" She stopped moving. "How do you know about that property?" "Because in Amarillo 2 days ago, I heard a man named Hollis Crane telling his companions over whiskey that a widow woman on Cutter Creek was proving stubborn about a sale, and that they were going to go remind her of the wisdom of cooperation." He paused. "I figured it was none of my business and kept riding. And yet here you are," she said flatly. "And yet here I am," he agreed, without apology or excuse. The sound of hooves was clearer now. She could feel it in the soles of her boots through the packed earth. "Mr. Weston," she said, "I have one bullet in this gun, 4 men riding at me, a 7-year-old daughter at home, and I have not slept properly in 3 days. Tell me something useful or get out of my way." He looked at her for one long moment, and something passed across his face that she could not name, but that did not look like indifference. Then he reached into his duster and produced a box of cartridges from his breast pocket, crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, and held it out. She stared at it. Then she took it. "I also have 2 Colt revolvers and a Winchester," he said, "and I am a reasonably good shot. If you are willing to trust me for the next 10 minutes, I think we can persuade those men to turn around without anyone getting killed. And after 10 minutes you can point that gun at me again if you like," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, dry and without resentment, that made her want to laugh in spite of everything. She did not laugh, but she wanted to. She opened the cartridge box and loaded the revolver with quick, practiced hands. Her late husband Thomas had insisted she know how to do it, and she had been grateful for that lesson more times than she could count in the past 14 months. "Do not get shot," she said to Levi Weston. "I do not need that on my conscience as well." "I will do my best," he said, and went to his horse to pull the Winchester from its scabbard. What followed was less a gunfight and more a negotiation conducted in the language of firepower. When the 4 riders crested the low rise and saw a man with a rifle standing in the road beside a woman with a loaded revolver, and an expression that suggested she would use it without hesitation, they pulled their horses to a stop in a cloud of red dust. There was a tense exchange, raised voices, threats made and countered, Levi's voice calm and deliberate and carrying an authority that came not from volume but from certainty. He knew 2 of the men by name, which seemed to unsettle them considerably. He mentioned the county sheriff by name as well, and the federal marshal out of Fort Worth, in a way that made it clear he was not bluffing. The man named Hollis Crane was exactly as unpleasant as Louisa had imagined from the events of 3 days prior. He was broad and red-faced, and wore his contempt for women who owned land openly on his features like a brand. He looked at Louisa the way men look at an obstacle rather than a person. But he looked at Levi Weston with something more complicated, something that contained an edge of genuine caution, and after a long and simmering standoff, he wheeled his horse and took his men back the way they had come. Louisa did not lower her gun until they were out of sight. Then she lowered it, and her arm was shaking so badly she had to hold it with both hands to keep the barrel from rattling. Levi did not comment on the shaking. He slid the Winchester back into its scabbard and came to stand beside her at a respectful distance, watching the empty road to the south. "They will come back," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Men like Hollis Crane always come back, but probably not today." She turned to look at him fully for the first time. Up close he was younger than she had initially guessed, somewhere in his early 30s, with a lean, weathered face and dark eyes that held a quality of steadiness she had not seen in a person's eyes for a long time. There was a scar along his jaw, old and faded. His hands, she noticed, were calloused in the particular way of a man who had worked with them his whole life, not just held a gun. "Who are you, Levi Weston?" she asked. "I do not mean your name. I mean, what are you doing on this road?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Moving," he said at last. "I was a ranch hand up in Colorado for 4 years. Before that, I worked cattle drives out of San Antonio. I'm heading east toward the Red River country. I heard there is work there." "Where is home for you?" Something flickered behind his eyes. "Nowhere presently," he said. "My mother passed 2 years ago, my father before that. I have a sister in Missouri, but we have not been close since I went west." He said it without self-pity, as a plain statement of fact. "I am not looking for sympathy," he added, as if he could read her expression. "I am just answering your question honestly." "I appreciate honest answers," she said. "I have not gotten many of them lately." She climbed back up onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins, and then she stopped and looked at him standing there in the road with his horse, a man with nowhere to be who had just spent his time and his cartridges helping a stranger, and she made a decision that she would examine later with considerable second-guessing, but that felt in the moment entirely right. "Come to the farm," she said. "I will feed you a proper meal and you can sleep in the barn tonight. It is the least I can do." He looked at her steadily. "I do not want to cause you trouble, Mr. Weston," she said with a patience she did not entirely feel. "You just faced down 4 armed men on my behalf. I think we are past the stage where your presence constitutes trouble." She paused. "Besides, I told you those men will come back. When they do, I would rather not be alone." He nodded slowly, swung back into the saddle, and fell in beside the wagon as she turned it north toward Cutter Creek. The farm was modest and hardworking, which was the kindest way to put it. The house was wood-framed, 2 rooms, with a covered porch that ran along the front, and a kitchen garden that had gone slightly to riot in the recent days, when Louisa had not had time or peace of mind for weeding. There was a barn in better repair than the house, because Thomas had always said a good barn kept the animals alive, and the animals kept the family alive. And there was a chicken coop, and a smokehouse, and a low fence that enclosed a kitchen garden where tomatoes and beans and squash grew with the stubborn determination of things that intended to survive whatever the Texas summer threw at them. Clara was on the porch when the wagon came up the track, the yellow cat asleep across her small feet, a piece of cornbread in her hand. She was 7 years old, with her father's brown hair and her mother's gray eyes, and she looked at the stranger on the bay horse with the frank and unconcerned curiosity that very young children have before the world teaches them to be afraid. "Who is that?" she asked as her mother climbed down from the wagon. "His name is Levi Weston," Louisa said, hugging her daughter briefly and with a ferocity that made Clara squeak. "He helped me on the road today. He is going to stay in the barn tonight." Clara looked at Levi with the solemn consideration of a person doing important official business. "Can he fix the loose board on the porch?" she asked. Louisa looked at Levi with an expression that was the closest thing to amusement she had managed in days. "I believe I can manage that," he said to Clara, and swung down from the saddle. He fixed the porch board that evening before supper. He also, without being asked, repaired the latch on the barn door that had been hanging crooked, noticed that one of the wagon wheels had a spoke that was working loose, and quietly pointed it out to Louisa, who added it to the list of things she was already keeping in her head like a stone she carried everywhere she went. After supper, which was beans and salt pork and cornbread and dried apple preserves from the previous fall, Clara fell asleep at the table, and Louisa carried her to bed while Levi sat at the kitchen table and drank his coffee in the particular silence of a man who is comfortable with quiet. When she came back, he was still there, and she poured herself a cup and sat across from him. "Tell me about Thomas Prescott," he said. She looked at him. It was an unexpected thing to say, and she thought about deflecting it the way she usually did when people asked about her husband, which was to give them the short version, the dignified version, the one that wrapped grief up neatly and put it somewhere respectable. But there was something about Levi Weston's stillness that made the short version seem inadequate. He was a good man, she said. Not a perfect man. He was stubborn and he worked too hard and he had a temper when he was tired. But he was good in the ways that matter. He built this house with his own hands. He learned to bake bread because I was sick for 3 months when I was carrying Clara and could not stand the smell of the kitchen. She paused. He died of a fever in April of last year. It came on fast and it took him in 5 days. The doctor said there was nothing to be done. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I have spent the 14 months since trying to keep what he built from falling apart. And Holly's crane. Holly's Crane represents a cattle company called the Meridian Land and Cattle Corporation out of Denver. They want this land because Cutter Creek runs through it, and water is worth more than gold out here. They started with letters, then lawyers, then the men who came 3 days ago. She paused. They broke 2 of my fences and knocked over my smokehouse and told me that the next visit would be less polite. What legal claim do they have? None that is real, she said. Thomas had the deed clear and free, and it came to me when he died. I have it in a tin box under the floorboard in the bedroom. My neighbor Marcus Webb, who is a lawyer by training though he ranches now, has looked at it and told me it is entirely sound. She looked at Levi steadily. The trouble is that sound papers and the law are not always the same thing out here. Sometimes the law is whoever has more men and more guns. That is true, he said, more often than it should be. Is that why you left Colorado? He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said simply. Something similar, a large operation buying out smaller ranches. I worked for one of the smaller ones. When it got sold out from under the owner, I had no place to be. Did the owner have a choice about selling? Less than he should have had. He looked down at his coffee. I wish I had done more. I have been thinking about that for a while. The kitchen was quiet except for the small sounds of the house settling, the wind moving outside, the distant call of a nightjar somewhere in the darkness. The lamp on the table threw a warm circle of light over the rough wood surface, the 2 coffee cups, the man's calloused hands around one and the woman's slender ones around the other. You can stay, Louisa said. Not just tonight. For as long as Holly's Crane is a problem, and in exchange for room and board, you can help me work this place. I cannot pay wages yet, but come the harvest I can offer a share of what the crops bring. He was quiet for a long moment. She could not tell what he was thinking, and she found that she minded less than she expected. Most men she could read easily. Levi Weston was more like weather, something you had to observe over time before you could begin to understand it. I do not want you to think I am charity, he said at last. I need a ranch hand and a deterrent, she said. That is not charity, that is commerce. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the architecture of one, the suggestion that a smile was possible. All right, he said. Then we have an agreement. He slept in the barn that night, and Louisa lay awake in her bedroom listening to the darkness, and trying to decide whether she had made a wise decision or a desperate one, and concluded that sometimes in this life, the two were indistinguishable from each other. The days that followed built themselves into a rhythm that surprised her with its steadiness. Levi Weston worked without complaint and without instruction, which was a quality she had not expected and came to value enormously. He seemed to have an instinct for what needed doing, moving through the list of deferred repairs and neglected tasks with a quiet thoroughness that made her realize, with a complicated pang, how much she had been struggling without admitting it. He mended the fence the Crane men had broken. He patched a section of roof on the barn that had been letting water in. He was up before dawn every morning, and she often heard him moving around the yard in the gray pre-light, checking on the horses, drawing water from the well, doing the 1,000 small things that keep a working farm from slowly coming apart. Clara adored him with the simple, wholehearted affection of a child who had been missing male presence in her life for over a year. She brought him things, the way children do when they are trying to share the world with someone, a smooth stone she found by the creek, a feather from a red-tailed hawk, a drawing she had made of the barn cat. He accepted each offering with the same serious attention, as if the smooth stone and the hawk feather were genuinely important, which to Clara they were, and so they were to him. Louisa watched this and felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. 2 weeks in, Marcus Webb rode over from his place on the east side of the creek to check on things, as he had been doing regularly since Thomas died. He was a big, gray-haired man in his 60s, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent years reading documents for the traps hidden in the language. He shook Levi's hand and looked him over in the thorough way of a man assessing not just the person in front of him, but the shape of the situation. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Marcus spread out a copy of the Meridian Corporation's most recent legal claim, which had arrived by post in Amarillo. "They are trying a new angle," Marcus said, running a thick finger along the text. "They are arguing that Thomas did not pay the final installment on the land purchase before he died, which would make the deed incomplete. It is not true, but they have manufactured a record that suggests it." He looked at Louisa. "Do you have the payment receipt?" "Thomas kept every receipt he ever wrote or received," Louisa said, and went to the tin box under the floorboard and came back with a bundle of papers tied with string. She spread them on the table and began sorting through them, with hands that were steadier than they looked. Levi sat at the corner of the table, not involving himself but watching, and when she found the receipt and set it down, he leaned forward slightly and read it in silence. "That is dated and signed by the land office clerk," he said, "and I believe the land office keeps duplicate records. A copy should exist in Amarillo." Marcus looked at him with increased respect. "You have dealt with this kind of thing before." "Enough times to know the shape of it," Levi said. "The Meridian Corporation is counting on the widow not knowing how to fight a paper battle. If you can get that duplicate record from the Amarillo Land Office and file a formal challenge to their claim with the county court, it puts them in a position where they either have to prove their fraud in open court or back down." "They will not want to go to court," Marcus said slowly. "They are operating in 3 other counties right now. A public dispute draws attention." "Exactly," Levi said. Louisa looked at him across the table. "You know a great deal about land law for a ranch hand." He met her eyes without deflection. "My father was a surveyor. He taught me to read a deed before I could read a Bible." A pause. "I have also been on the losing end of enough land disputes to understand how they work from the inside out." There was a gravity to those words, a weight of personal history that she recognized because she carried her own weight of it. She did not push him further, but she filed the information carefully in the back of her mind. Marcus took the receipts to Amarillo 3 days later and began the legal process with the seriousness of a man who understood that the machinery of justice in 1878 moved slowly but could, when properly loaded, fire straight and true. In the meantime, life on the Prescott farm continued, and Louisa found herself paying a different kind of attention to the man who slept in her barn. She noticed the way he spoke to the horses, quietly, with his hand on their necks, as if they were people worth talking to. She noticed that he read at night by the lamp in the barn, actual books, which she caught a glimpse of one evening when she brought out his supper, a volume of Shakespeare that looked as if it had traveled considerable miles. She noticed that he never talked about himself unless asked, but that when he answered, he told the truth without embellishment or apology. She noticed, in the way you notice something that begins as background and gradually becomes foreground, that he was handsome in a quiet way that did not announce itself, but rather accumulated, like the way a landscape becomes beautiful when you stop moving through it fast enough to actually see it. She pushed this observation to the back of her mind with the firmness of a woman who has practical matters to attend to. He was chopping wood one afternoon in late August when she brought him a cup of water and stayed longer than she meant to, sitting on the fence rail, watching him work. The heat was brutal and he had taken his shirt off, and she became suddenly and thoroughly absorbed in studying the grain of the fence post beside her. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He set the axe down and turned. "You can ask," he said. I will answer if I can. Have you ever been in love? She said it with the directness she used for all difficult questions, looking at him squarely. It was either courage or something that looked enough like it to function the same way. He was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone evading, but in the way of someone taking the question seriously. Once, he said, when I was 24, her name was Rachel. She was the daughter of the rancher I was working for in New Mexico territory. He picked up the water cup and drank from it. Her father sent her east to her aunt's house in Virginia when he noticed how things were going. He did not consider me a suitable prospect. He handed the empty cup back to her. She wrote me one letter after she arrived in Virginia, and then no more. I do not know if she chose to stop or if the letters were stopped for her. He said it plainly, without bitterness. That was 7 years ago. I am sorry, she said, and meant it. It was a long time ago, he said. I have had time to make my peace with it. He reached for the axe handle again. What made you ask? I was trying to understand you, she said honestly. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes, and something passed between them in the warm August air, something wordless and entirely unambiguous. She felt it move through her like the first cool wind before a storm, that particular shift in the quality of the air that tells you the weather is about to change. She climbed down from the fence rail and went back to the house before either of them had to decide what to do with it. That night she sat on the porch after Clara was asleep and watched the stars, which were magnificent and indifferent in the way the Texas sky always was, arching from horizon to horizon as if the darkness had been deliberately designed to hold as much light as possible. She was sitting there in the still heat when she heard Levi's step on the path from the barn, and he stopped when he saw her. I did not mean to disturb you, he said. You are not disturbing me, she said. Sit down. He sat on the step below her, his back against the porch post, and they were quiet together for a while in the way that two people are quiet when the silence has become something comfortable, something worth keeping. Tell me about Thomas, he said, not with prying but with genuine care. She looked at the stars. He proposed to me by saying that he intended to build the best farm in Donley County and that he believed I was the only person he knew who would work hard enough to help him make it true. She smiled, and it was real, a smile that carried both love and grief in it, the way such smiles do when the person you loved is gone. It was the least romantic proposal imaginable, and I said yes immediately. He was right about the working hard part, Levi said. He was right about most things, she said. I miss his certainty. He always knew what to do. I have had to learn how to be certain for myself, and it is harder when you are doing it alone. You are not doing it alone right now, he said, and it was such a simple thing said so quietly that she was entirely unprepared for the way it hit her, square in the center of her chest. No, she said after a moment. I am not. They sat in the dark for a while longer, and then said good night with the careful formality of two people who are both aware that something is changing and have not yet decided how fast to let it move. September came with a slight cooling in the mornings, the first hint that summer was prepared to eventually relent, and with it came a letter from Marcus Webb in Amarillo that contained good news layered inside difficult news, the way things often worked when lawyers were involved. The county court had accepted the formal challenge to the Meridian Corporation's claim, and a hearing had been scheduled for October. The duplicate receipt from the land office had been found and certified, which was the good part. The difficult part was that Holly's Crane had responded by filing a counterclaim that was spurious but complicated, designed to bog down the proceedings and drain Lewis's resources. Marcus estimated that a full legal resolution could take the better part of a year. A year, Louisa said flatly, holding the letter at the kitchen table. Levi had read it over her shoulder, a liberty she had not consciously granted him but had not pulled away from either. He stepped back and sat down. A year is not forever, he said. A year is a very long time when you are fighting for your farm, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking about something. Meridian Corporation does not just want your land, they want your water. Cutter Creek is the reason. He spread his hands on the table, a gesture she had come to recognize as the prelude to a problem being thought through out loud. There are 3 other landowners along Cutter Creek. Have you spoken with them about forming a united front against the corporation? She stared at him. I have not. If the corporation is pursuing your property, they are almost certainly pursuing theirs as well. 3 landowners together defending the same water rights is a considerably stronger position than one widow defending her farm. She felt the clarity of it move through her. Margaret Holt is 2 miles north. The Vasquez family is at the southern bend. She paused. I know Margaret well. Jorge Vasquez I know less, but Thomas did business with him and found him honorable. Then it might be worth having those conversations, Levi said. She looked at him across the table, this man who had ridden in from nowhere and in the space of 6 weeks had become so woven into the fabric of her days that she could not easily imagine them without him. You are very good at this, she said, at thinking through problems. I have had a lot of practice with problems, he said dryly. No, she said, I mean more than that. You think clearly and you think about other people, not just about the mechanics of a situation. That is rarer than you seem to realize. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to learn, the one where something moved through his eyes that he did not put into words, something considered and warm and careful. Thank you, he said simply. They rode to Margaret Holt's place the next day, leaving Clara with the Herrera family down the road who were old friends, and had 5 children who Clara considered the greatest possible company. Margaret was a widow herself, 60 years old, tough as braided rawhide, with a laugh like a hawk's cry and an absolute refusal to be intimidated by anyone. She heard the plan, said yes before Louisa had finished explaining it, and immediately began listing the lawyers she knew personally and the local county commissioner who owed her a favor from the previous election. Jorge Vasquez was more cautious, but ultimately equally resolute. He was a compact, careful man in his 50s who had built his ranch from nothing at a time when Mexican landowners in Texas faced pressures from multiple directions at once. The kind of injustice that the territory wore as ordinary business, and he had survived it through intelligence and the particular stubbornness of someone who has been underestimated enough times to stop letting it bother him. When Levi explained the legal strategy, Jorge nodded slowly and said in his precise, accented English that he had been waiting for someone to suggest exactly this, and that he had a cousin in Austin who worked in the state land office and might be able to provide useful information. Riding back to the farm in the long afternoon light, with the grass catching the golden slant of the sun and turning the world amber, Louisa felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not safety exactly, but the thing that makes safety possible, the sense that you are not standing alone in the path of what is coming. This might actually work, she said. It might, Levi agreed. He was riding beside her at an easy pace, the bay moving smoothly on the familiar road. You should know, she said, looking ahead at the road, that I intend to fight for this land until there is no fighting left to do. Whatever the court decides, whatever Holly's crane does next, whatever it costs. Thomas built this place and Clara will inherit it and I will not let it be taken. I know, he said quietly. She looked at him. I want to know if that is something you can be a part of, not just for now. I want to know if you are the kind of man who stays when things are hard or the kind who moves on. He did not answer immediately. They rode in silence for a few minutes, the horses' hooves marking time on the road, and then he said, I have been the kind who moves on up until now. That is the honest answer. He paused. But I am beginning to believe that was less a personality trait and more a consequence of never having found a reason to stay. She felt that settle over her the way warmth settles, gradually and completely. That is a very careful thing to say, she told him. I'm a very careful man, he said, and finally let the smile fully happen, and she discovered that it transformed his face entirely, that the architecture she had been observing for weeks was in fact the frame for something genuinely radiant, and she had to look back at the road ahead because the sight of it made her chest hurt in the best possible way. October arrived, and with it two things simultaneously: the court hearing in Amarillo and a night that changed everything between them. It was a Wednesday, about 2 weeks before the scheduled hearing, and Louisa had been awake since before 4 in the morning going over documents with Marcus by lamplight. The two of them spread out around the kitchen table, arguing in low voices about procedural matters that made her head ache. By the time Marcus left at mid-morning, she was exhausted in a bone-deep way that went beyond ordinary tiredness. She went out to the barn to check on the horses and found Levi there, rubbing down his bay horse after a morning ride to check the northern fence line. The barn smelled of hay and warm horses and oil and leather, and the light came in long and golden through the gaps in the boards, and she sat down on a hay bale and put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She was long past crying being a release rather than a surrender, but she sat there with her face in her hands and let herself be exhausted for a moment, just a moment. She heard him set down the grooming brush. She heard his boots on the barn floor. And then he sat down beside her on the hay bale, not touching her, just present, and said nothing, which was exactly right. After a while she lifted her face. "I am tired," she said, because it was true and there was no point in dressing it up otherwise. "I know," he said. "I am tired of fighting," she said. Not tired enough to stop, but tired. She looked at him. In the barn light his face was close and warm, and the scar on his jaw was silver and old. "Do you know what I miss most about having someone? It is not the practical things, though I miss those too. It is having someone who knows the whole shape of your worry. Thomas always knew the whole shape of it, not just the parts I showed people." She paused. "I find that I have been showing you more of the shape than I intended." He looked at her steadily. "I am glad you have," he said. "Are you?" she said softly. "Louisa." He said her name with a deliberateness that made it feel different from the way he usually said it. "I think you know by now how I feel." "I think I do," she said. "I think I have known for a while. I have been wondering whether to do anything about it." "And," he said, "and I am 32 years old, and I have a daughter and a farm and a lawsuit," she said, "and I have decided that life is too short and too hard to ignore the things that make it worth living." He leaned forward and kissed her very gently, with a care that felt like a question, and she answered it by kissing him back. And the barn was warm and golden and smelled of hay, and her whole body recognized this as something real, something earned, something entirely different from resignation. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing adequate to say, and they both had enough sense to know it. "You should sleep," he said finally, straightening. "You look like the earth has been trying to pull you down for 3 days." She laughed, actually laughed, a sound so unfamiliar in her own throat that it surprised her. "You are a romantic soul," she said dryly. "I contain multitudes," he said, and there it was again, that smile. She went and slept for 4 hours and woke up feeling as if the world had been cleaned and rearranged while she was not looking. Clara noticed the change immediately, the way children do. She was 7, and she paid attention to her mother with the seriousness of someone for whom her mother was the fixed point around which all other things orbited. She did not say anything directly, but she began sitting next to Levi at supper with even more deliberate purpose, as if she were making a territorial claim on his behalf, and she started calling him by his first name instead of Mr. Weston, which had been her previous formal usage. One morning, about a week after the hay bale afternoon, she looked up from her breakfast and said to Levi, "Are you going to stay here forever?" He looked at Louisa, and Louisa looked at him, and the question sat in the air between all three of them like something made of glass, fragile and transparent and showing the light through it. "I am working on it," Levi said to Clara, which was honest and careful and exactly right. Clara seemed satisfied with this and went back to her oatmeal. The court hearing in Amarillo was on the 15th of October, 1878, and it was a long, exhausting day of legal arguments in a room that smelled of tobacco and pine and old paper. Louisa sat very straight and very still through 6 hours of proceedings. listening to Marcus argue with a systematic thoroughness that she had not witnessed before, and that impressed her enormously. Jorge Vasquez's cousin in Austin had indeed provided documentation from the state land office that severely undermined the Meridian Corporation's manufactured record. Margaret Holt had contributed a signed affidavit from the county commissioner that was, in Marcus's words, particularly helpful. Hollis Crane sat across the room with two lawyers in expensive coats, and he looked at Louisa throughout the proceedings with the expression of a man who has made up his mind that this is only a temporary inconvenience. She met his gaze each time without looking away, which she had practiced. Levi sat beside her. He had worn his good shirt and his hat, and he was utterly still through all 6 hours, a stillness that was not passive but controlled, like a river at low water that is deeper than it looks. When the judge recessed for deliberation, Levi put his hand over hers on the bench between them without looking at her, just for a moment, and then took it away. The judge's preliminary ruling was in their favor. It was not the end of the matter. Marcus explained carefully on the ride back that the Meridian Corporation would likely appeal, and that the process would continue into the new year. But the manufacturing of false records had been formally identified and noted in the court documents, which made any future Meridian action considerably more difficult and considerably more visible. That night they ate supper at the farmhouse, Marcus and his wife Eleanor, Margaret Holt, Jorge Vasquez and his eldest son, and Louisa and Clara and Levi. It was the most people the kitchen table had held since before Thomas died. Louisa had cooked for 2 days, and Margaret brought a dried peach pie, and Eleanor Webb brought a jar of honey from her own bees. They ate with the warmth and noise and overlap of people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side. Clara sat on Levi's left and Marcus's wife on his right, and he handled both with the same composed good humor, and Louisa, watching from the other side of the table, felt something knit itself together inside her that had been in separate pieces for a very long time. Later, when everyone had gone and Clara was in bed, she and Levi stood on the porch in the October cool, which was genuinely cool now, the first real relief after the summer. The stars were out in full force. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I have been thinking about what Clara asked about staying." He looked at the stars for a moment. "I want to stay. Not as a ranch hand on a temporary arrangement. I want to stay in the actual and complete sense of that word." He turned to look at her, and even in the darkness she could see the quality of it in his face, the serious, settled certainty of someone who has examined a thing from every angle and knows what he thinks. "I understand that is a large thing to say to a woman who is still working through what she lost, and what she is protecting, and what she wants her life to be. I am not asking for an answer tonight. I just did not want to keep it to myself any longer." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him in the starlight. "Levi," she said. "Yes." "I have been alone for 14 months, she said. "Not counting the last 2 of them when you were here, which have been different from the 14 before in every way that matters. I know the difference between loneliness that is bearable and loneliness that has a weight to it that changes the shape of you." She paused. "I do not want to go back to the kind that changes the shape of you." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood on the porch of the house that Thomas built in the October dark, and the stars did what they always do, which is remain enormous and indifferent and beautiful. "I need some time," she said, honest as always. "Not a great deal of it, but some. I need to be sure that what I feel is what I think it is, and not just relief or gratitude or the fact that you are a good man who appeared when I needed one." "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She believed him. November came with cold nights and the beginning of preparations for winter, the serious business of laying in enough wood and food and fodder to get through the months when the Texas panhandle showed its unforgiving face. Levi worked with an energy that matched the season, as if he understood instinctively that now was the time to store against future difficulty, and she worked alongside him, and they fell into the comfortable, efficient partnership of two people who have learned each other's rhythms. One afternoon they were working on the root cellar, reinforcing the door frame that had begun to rot at the hinges, and she handed him a tool and their fingers touched, and she held on for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and he looked at her and she said, "I have had enough time." He set down the tool. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she did most things, directly and without decoration, looking at him straight. "I am certain that is what it is, because I have been paying very careful attention to it, and it does not feel like relief or gratitude. It feels like the specific person. It feels like you." She paused. "I am not asking you to be Thomas. I am not looking for a replacement. I am asking you to be Levi Weston, who is a person I love and want in my life in the permanent way." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and pulled her into his arms and held her with a thoroughness, a completeness, that was entirely unlike anything she had experienced before, different from Thomas not in quality but in character, its own thing, its own particular warmth. She let herself be held in it without reservation, which was something that had taken her the better part of a year to be capable of. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I have been figuring out how to say that for about 6 weeks. She laughed into his shoulder. "6 weeks," she said. "You slow-moving man." "I was being careful," he said, with a dignity that she thoroughly destroyed by laughing harder. He asked her to marry him in December, on a clear and cold morning after the first light snow had come and gone, leaving the ground pale and the sky a clean winter blue. He asked her on the porch, which seemed right, because it was the porch where they had started to find each other in the dark in September, and she said yes before he had quite finished the sentence, which made him lose his composure for the first time she could remember, a helpless, unguarded smile that rearranged his whole face. Clara, when told, considered the information with the gravity of a judge deliberating on a complex case, and then said, "Does that mean Levi will sleep in the house?" And when Louisa confirmed that yes, eventually it did mean that, Clara said, "Good, because the barn is cold," and went back to reading the illustrated almanac that Marcus Webb's wife had given her. The wedding was in February, small and entirely real, with Marcus Webb presiding since the nearest minister was in Amarillo and the roads were sometimes impassable in winter. Margaret Holt was Louisa's witness. Jorge Vasquez's eldest son, a young man of 20 named Eduardo who had become something of a friend to Levi over the course of the preceding months, stood as Levi's witness. Clara stood between her mother and Levi with her hand in each of theirs, and looked as if the entire arrangement had been her personal idea, and she was satisfied with how it had turned out. They spoke their vows by the fireplace in the parlor, with the winter outside and the warmth inside and the lamp throwing its gold over all of them, and Louisa felt the truth of it in every word, the specific weight of choosing, the specific gravity of "I will." He moved his few possessions from the barn to the house, and his books lined up on the shelf beside hers, and his coat hung on the hook beside her coat, and these small domestic facts made her feel, unexpectedly and consistently, as if the world had been put back together correctly. Winter passed in the intimate and demanding way of winters on a Texas farm, the cold requiring constant management, and the house holding them close together in the evenings around the fire. They read to each other, which was a habit that started accidentally one evening, and then became a fixed feature of their nights, trading off passages from the books on the shelf, while Clara drew pictures at the table, and the wind worked itself against the windows and found nothing to get through. He told her about Colorado, about the ranch he had worked on, about the owner, a Scottish man named Callum Fraser who had built the place over 20 years and lost it in the space of 6 months to a corporation not unlike Meridian. He told her about his father, the surveyor, a precise and exacting man who had nonetheless had a talent for the names of stars and had taught Levi all of them, which explained the ease with which he moved through the night sky when she had asked him about it. He told her about the Red River country he had been heading for when he came south on that road in August, and she told him she was glad he had come south instead of east, and he agreed that the direction had proved fortunate. She told him things she had not told anyone else, the specific shape of grief in the first weeks after Thomas died, the way the farm had felt like it was accusing her somehow, all his work everywhere she looked, the difficulty of crying in front of Clara who needed her to be steady. She told him about the night she had taken the revolver out and thought about that fifth bullet, and he listened without flinching, and without the kind of horrified sympathy that wants to make the teller feel worse, listening instead with the quality of a man who is not afraid of difficult truths. "You kept the bullet," he said. "I kept the bullet," she said. "And it was there on the road in August, which was a good thing." "It was a very good thing," he said quietly. The legal proceedings with the Meridian Corporation continued through the winter and into the spring of 1879, following the slow and grinding course of frontier law. But Jorge Vasquez's cousin in Austin proved to be an extraordinarily useful contact, and Marcus Webb's methodical construction of the case was like watching a careful craftsman build something designed to last. In March, the Meridian Corporation's appeal was denied, and their fraudulent records formally noted in the county court documents. In April, Hollis Crane made one final attempt. He came to the farm himself, without his men, which was either confident or desperate, and rode up to the house on a Thursday morning when Louisa was in the kitchen and Levi was splitting wood in the yard. Levi put the axe down and stood between Crane and the house. Louisa came out onto the porch when she heard the horse. "I have a new offer," Crane said from the saddle, addressing Louisa over Levi's shoulder with the studied rudeness of a man who refuses to acknowledge the person immediately in front of him. "Considerably more generous than the previous ones." "I have told you before, and I am telling you for the last time," Louisa said from the porch, her voice entirely conversational in its steadiness. "This land is not for sale. Not to you, not to your corporation, not for any amount. This creek and this farm will go to my daughter and then to her children, and that is the end of the discussion." Crane looked at her for a long moment with an expression that cycled through contempt and frustration, and eventually landed on something that was, if she read it correctly, a kind of grudging recognition. He was dealing with someone who was not going to bend. He had perhaps known it for a while. He turned his horse without another word and rode south, and neither of them ever saw Hollis Crane again. 3 months later, Marcus Webb told them that the Meridian Land and Cattle Corporation had withdrawn from Donley County entirely, moving their operations to Kansas. The land dispute was formally resolved in Louisa's favor in June of 1879. She read the final court document at the kitchen table, with the June light coming in through the window and her hands flat on the paper and Levi standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder. And she let herself feel it fully, the completion of it, the hard-won permanence of it. "Thomas," she said quietly, not to Levi, not to anyone in the room exactly, just saying the name. "We kept it." Clara, who had been in the yard and came in for something and found her mother with her hands on the papers and her eyes bright, climbed into Louisa's lap without asking and put both small arms around her neck. Levi quietly went out to the porch, giving them the moment, and she loved him for that as much as for any other thing. The summer of 1879 settled over the Prescott farm, which people had begun to call the Weston place in casual reference, though the deed still read Prescott, and Louisa had not asked Levi how he felt about that, and he had not brought it up. It was a summer of growth in every sense. The crops were good, better than the previous 2 years, and with Levi's labor added to hers, the farm produced not just enough to sustain them, but a genuine surplus that Marcus Webb helped them sell at the Amarillo market. With some of that money, Louisa repaired the kitchen properly for the first time, replacing the cracked stove pipe and getting new shutters for the windows that actually fit and kept the winter wind out. With some of it, they bought 2 more horses, which expanded what they could manage in terms of acreage. With some of it, she set aside money for Clara's education, which she considered non-negotiable, and had been worrying about for 2 years. With a small portion of it, Levi bought her a book she had mentioned once in passing, a volume she had loved as a young woman and lost in the move from her parents' home to the farm, and he gave it to her on an ordinary Tuesday evening with no ceremony whatsoever. Just set it on the table beside her coffee cup, and she picked it up and held it and said nothing for a moment because there was a lump in her throat. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember most of what you say," he said, in the tone of a man reporting a fact. She looked at him across the table, this man who had ridden down a road from the south in August of the previous year with 2 Colt revolvers and a box of cartridges, and the patience of someone who had been moving for a long time and had finally, perhaps, stopped. "You are a good man, Levi Weston," she said. "You make it easier," he said simply. In September of 1879, she told him she was pregnant. She had known for about 3 weeks and had spent those 3 weeks examining her feelings about it with the thoroughness she applied to everything. She was glad. She was genuinely, uncomplicated-ly glad, and that itself was something she had not been certain of in advance. Clara had been planned and wanted and had arrived in a world that still had Thomas in it. This was different circumstances, a different chapter, a different version of herself doing the wanting. She told him in the kitchen in the evening with her hands around her coffee cup and watched his face move through surprise and something that built quickly into something she could only call radiant. "Are you all right?" he asked first, which was so entirely him that she had to press her lips together to keep from laughing. "I am very well," she said. "I am happy about it." He came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her, and she could feel him breathing, slow and deliberate, the way he breathed when something had moved him deeply. "I am happy about it too," he said, against the top of her head. "I am extremely happy about it. I did not know I wanted this until just now, and it turns out I have wanted it for a long time." Clara took the news of a coming sibling with thoughtful consideration, and then asked 3 very practical questions about sleeping arrangements, which they answered as honestly as they could. And then she said she wanted it to be a girl, and Louisa told her that these things were not exactly something you could arrange in advance, and Clara said that was an unfortunate system. She was wrong about her preference, as it happened. In the spring of 1880, on a clear April morning when the wildflowers were just beginning to come up along Cutter Creek and the air had that particular scrubbed quality of new season days, she delivered a boy who came into the world with considerable volume and opinion, which seemed to indicate he intended to be around for a long time. They named him Thomas James Weston, Thomas for the man who had built the farm, and James for Levi's father, the surveyor who had taught him the names of stars. Levi held his son for the first time in the bedroom of the house with the afternoon light coming in through the new shutters, and Louisa watched from the bed, tired and entirely at peace, and saw on his face an expression she had never quite seen before, something so undefended and complete that she kept it in her memory like a pressed flower, something to return to. Clara looked at her brother for a long moment and then said, with the resigned practicality of a person accepting what cannot be changed, "He is quite small." "He will get bigger," Louisa told her. "I suppose that is how it works," Clara said, and climbed up onto the bed beside her mother. And Levi sat in the chair by the window with his son in his arms. And outside Cutter Creek moved over its stones as it always had and always would, indifferent to history, generous with water, keeping the land alive. In the summer of 1880, the farm was as good as it had ever been, better in some respects, because there were 2 of them running it now with full commitment, and Clara was 8 and helpful in the way of a determined child who wants to be treated as competent. Marcus Webb had retired from most of his farming and had begun doing legal consultation for ranchers in the county, and he sent business toward Levi as a kind of informal recommender, because Levi's knowledge of land law and deeds was real and useful, and there were always people who needed it. Louisa wrote letters to her sister in Tennessee, something she had not done regularly since the hard years, and her sister wrote back with news of an easier life but a smaller one. And they found their way back to each other through correspondence, the way old friends find their way back to each other through conversation, starting in the middle of things without needing to explain the beginning. She also wrote once to the land office in Amarillo to formally record Levi's name on the deed alongside hers. He had not asked for it. She had simply done it and handed him the copy of the updated record across the breakfast table one morning. He looked at it for a moment. "You did not have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "It is your farm, too. You should have the paper that says so." He folded it carefully and put it in the breast pocket of his shirt against his chest, and she went on eating her breakfast without comment. But she felt it, the rightness of it, the simple justice of a thing properly recorded. In the fall of that year, Margaret Holt rode over with news that the county was considering putting a proper schoolhouse in Hales Crossing, which was the settlement 3 miles east, and that there was discussion of hiring a teacher from Amarillo. Clara had been receiving her education from her mother and from the books on the shelf, which was not nothing, but a proper school was something Louisa had been hoping for since they had moved to the farm when Clara was 2. The school was built the following spring, in 1881, and Clara walked to it 3 days a week with Eduardo Vasquez's youngest sister Maria, who was also 8, and came home with opinions and information, and eventually, a particular boy named Henry who sat near the window and had read more books than anyone else in the class, which Clara considered the only real qualification for consideration. Louisa watched her daughter grow with the particular mix of joy and ache that parents have always felt, the awareness that growing up is a small continuous leaving, and was glad, not for the first time, that she had Levi beside her to feel it with, to exchange the look across the room that said, "I see it too, I know." Thomas grew from a large-lunged opinion into a roving, fearless toddler who had inherited his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, and his own entirely individual character that belonged to neither of them, which was exactly right. He was 18 months old and already attempting to assist with tasks that were dramatically beyond his developmental stage, including once trying to carry a pail of water that was larger than he was, which he would not relinquish to any adult for a full 10 minutes. Levi, watching his son's ferocious determination to carry the pail, had a look on his face that Louisa had come to recognize as his love face, the one he wore when something moved him too much for words, and she stood in the yard in the September afternoon and thought about the road in August of 1878, and the gun in her hand and the one bullet, and the man who had come from the South with cartridges in his pocket and patience in his character, and felt the whole shape of it. She thought about Thomas, her first Thomas, and about the way grief changes over time, not diminishing exactly but becoming something you carry differently, something that becomes integrated into the architecture of who you are rather than being the thing that is crushing the life out of you. She could think of him now with love that was clear of the desperate ache, and she was glad of that, because it meant she could keep him with her in the way he deserved. She could also stand in the yard in September 1881 with her daughter in school and her son in the dirt with a pail too big for him and her husband watching their son with that face, and feel entirely, abundantly, solidly alive. "Levi," she said. He turned. "Come here," she said. He came across the yard and she put her arms around him in the open in the daylight without any of the careful formality of the first months, just directly and completely, and he held her back in the same way. "What is this for?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Nothing specific, everything." He rested his chin on top of her head. "All right," he said. Little Thomas, denied his audience, dragged the pail to where they were standing and said something that was not quite a word, but was clearly a demand for attention, and Levi picked him up with one arm while keeping the other around Louisa, and Thomas grabbed his father's hat and put it over his own face, which produced a muffled noise of deep personal satisfaction. The October of 1881 brought a second letter from Jorge Vasquez, with news that the remaining Meridian Corporation interests in the region had been fully dissolved, that the Denver company had overextended itself in too many directions and collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions. It was a satisfying coda to a story that had begun on a road in August of 1878, and Marcus Webb opened a bottle of good brandy he had been saving for a special occasion, and they drank it around the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where so many of the important conversations had happened, with the lamp on and the cold outside and Clara at the table doing her school arithmetic with the focused intensity she brought to everything, and Thomas asleep in the other room. "Do you remember," Marcus said, a little expansive from the brandy, "when I first came to this farm after you told me about Levi, and I looked him over like I was buying a horse?" "I remember," Louisa said. "I told Alina when I got home that night that either you had made the best decision of your life or a very considerable mistake," Marcus said, "and that the only difference between the two was time." "And your verdict?" Levi asked. Marcus raised his glass. "I have been wrong before," he said, "but this is not one of those times." The spring of 1882 came early, the way some springs do in the Panhandle, arriving like someone who cannot wait any longer, with wildflowers along Cutter Creek and the grass going green from the south like a tide rolling in. Clara was 10 now, serious and bright and full of opinions about everything from literature to the proper way to treat a horse, and she and Louisa had developed the specific relationship of two strong-minded women who love each other absolutely and argue cheerfully about nearly everything. Louisa was expecting again. She told Levi on the porch in the March evening, and he sat quietly for a moment with his hands on his knees looking at the stars, and then he said, "Are you happy about it?" "Extremely," she said. "Then I am too," he said, and the simplicity of it was everything. This time Clara got her wish. In November of 1882, a girl arrived who they named Ruth Alina for Marcus's wife who had become as close to family as family gets. Ruth came into the world more quietly than her brother had, but with no less clear a sense of personal purpose, and by the time she was 3 weeks old, it was apparent that she had opinions about the world and intended to express them at length. Clara held Ruth with the careful pride of a 10-year-old who takes responsibility seriously, and Thomas, now 2, observed his sister with the mixed feelings of someone who has been the center of things and is adjusting to the new arrangement. Levi stood in the yard one evening that November with Thomas on his shoulders and looked at the farm, at the house with the light in the windows and the barn in good repair and the creek running silver in the dusk light, and Louisa came to stand beside him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I came south on that road in August of 1878 because it looked like the easier route," he said, "and I have been grateful for laziness of navigation every single day since." She took his hand. His fingers laced through hers with the ease of long practice. "I could have made you keep going," she said. "When I had the gun on you, I could have told you to ride past." "You could have," he agreed. "I am glad I did not." "So am I," he said, "more than I have words for." The stars were coming out over Texas, the same stars his father had named for him, the same stars he had been sleeping under for years of moving and looking for a place to stop. They were over the farm now and over the house and over the children inside it and over the woman beside him, and they did not care about any of that, the way stars never do, but they were beautiful regardless, maybe more beautiful for the indifference. "Levi," Louisa said. "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something I should have said earlier, but I am saying it now." "Tell me." "Thank you," she said, "for stopping on that road. For the cartridges and the Winchester and for staying, for not being the kind of man who moves on." "You said you needed someone who stays," he reminded her. "I said I needed to know if you were that kind of man," she corrected. "You turned out to be. I did not make you that. That is who you were already." He was quiet for a moment, Thomas dozing on his shoulders with the total relaxation of a sleeping child, the weight of him warm and trusting. "I think I was always that kind of man," he said. "I just had not found the right place to put it yet." The farm was quiet around them, the good quiet of a place that knows what it is, that has been fought for and kept and lived in by people who meant it. The creek moved in the dark. The horses shifted in the barn. The lamplight in the windows was warm against the November cold, and inside that warmth were Clara with her books and Ruth in her cradle, and the whole accumulated life of a woman who had stood on a road with one bullet left and made a decision that changed everything. She leaned her head against Levi's arm, and he put his free hand around her shoulders, and they stood together in the quiet of the farm on Cutter Creek in the last weeks of 1882, knowing what they had, knowing how unlikely it was, knowing that the thing you fight for is the thing you keep. In the years that followed, Thomas grew into a boy who was fearless with horses and meticulous with numbers, who could ride before he was 5, and was reading deed documents with comprehension by the time he was 9, which made his father quietly proud in a way that was entirely without pressure, but entirely without concealment. He had his grandfather's name and his father's precision and something else besides, something that was entirely his own, the thing each child brings that belongs to no one before them. Ruth grew into a girl who was like weather, changeable and powerful and ultimately her own system, with her mother's direct gray eyes and a laugh that started somewhere deep and came out enormous, and who decided at age 6 that she intended to be a doctor, which in 1888 was a declaration that came with considerable obstacles and about which she was entirely unconcerned. Louisa told her she believed her, which was the truth, and Levi told her he would help her find a way, which was also the truth. Clara married at 20, in 1892, a man named William Archer who taught school in Hales Crossing and had read more books than anyone else in the county, which was the qualification Clara had always considered primary. The wedding was at the farm in June, with the wildflowers still on the creek banks, and the whole extended family of neighbors and friends who had become family over the years gathered in the yard under a sky that cooperated by being spectacular. Louisa cried at her daughter's wedding, which surprised her, not because she was sad but because the completeness of it moved her past the point of containment, and Levi handed her his handkerchief without comment and kept his arm around her through the whole ceremony. "She is not leaving," he said quietly. "She is just growing." "I know," Louisa said into his shoulder. "That is why I am crying." The farm on Cutter Creek remained in the family, as Louisa had always promised it would. The deed was updated again in 1885 to include language about inheritance that Marcus Webb had drafted with his usual thorough care, ensuring that the land would pass to Clara and Thomas and Ruth in equal portions, with provisions for the water rights that had caused all the trouble in the first place. The Cutter Creek water kept the farm alive through dry years and kept the creek running through wet ones, indifferent to the human dramas that took place along its banks, just doing what water does, finding its way to where it needed to go. In the autumn of 1893, Louisa and Levi sat on the porch in the September evening as they had done 1,000 times, with the different quality of people who have grown into a life together rather than been arranged into one. She was 47 and he was 46, and they had the look of people who have spent years outdoors and working, the weathering that is not damage but history, the record of a life in the open air. Thomas was 13 and out in the barn doing something with the horses. Ruth was 11 and inside reading a medical text that Marcus Webb had sourced for her from a bookseller in Amarillo. Clara and William lived in Hales Crossing and came for Sunday supper most weeks. "What are you thinking about?" Levi asked. It was the same question she had asked him in the yard in 1881, returned across the years. "The road," she said. "I think about that road sometimes." "Which road?" "You know which road," she said. He smiled, and it was still the smile that had surprised her the first time she saw it, still the one that rearranged his face into something that made her chest ache in the good way. "The road," he said. "I had one bullet," she said. "And I asked you which direction trouble was coming from. And I told you," he said, "and then you gave me a box of cartridges. You needed them more than I did at that moment." She looked at him, this man who had given her a box of cartridges and then, in the particular way of things that begin with practical necessity and become something else entirely, given her everything else. "I am glad I did not tell you to keep writing," she said. "You told me that before," he said. "I know," she said. "It bears repeating." He took her hand on the porch arm between them, the same way he had in the Amarillo courtroom in 1878, just for a moment, and then he did not take it away. He kept it, and she kept his, and they sat in the September evening on the porch of the house that Thomas Prescott had built, and that Louisa Prescott had kept, and that Levi Weston had helped keep, and that now bore both of their names on the deed in the land office in Amarillo, and listened to the sounds of their children and their farm and the creek that ran below the property, the water that had started everything, the water that kept everything alive. The stars came out the way they always did, enormous and unhurried and magnificent, and Levi named them the way his father had taught him, not out loud but quietly in his own mind. The old habit, the map of the sky that had been with him through all the years of moving, and had brought him in the end to this road, to this farm, to this woman with one bullet left who had asked him which direction trouble was coming from, and had, in the same breath, without knowing it, told him exactly where to stay.